Welcome back to Dentro la Storia, the channel for those who love contemporary history. This April, as we have already announced, we have prepared a special playlist, a mini-series dedicated to the liberation. In this mini-series, we have already published 3 episodes. On the 1st of April, we covered the story of Mussolini in his last year, the Mussolini of Salo. Then on April 6th, the RSI, the Italian Social Republic. Finally, on April 11th, we published the final chapter of another mini-series, the Civil War mini-series, to clarify the nature of the War of Liberation, which was not a civil war. Today we are talking about a topic that is still part of the War of Liberation, but in some ways anticipates the birth of the Republic. It's a different topic than usual. It's a purely political topic, but we're not talking about parties, because as you know, we keep things dry, distant from national and party rhetoric. Today we're talking about the Salerno turning point, about that very particular agreement between the Italian political forces, which managed on one hand to unify the resistance struggle, the partisan activity, and on the other hand laid the foundations for what would become the path toward the institutional referendum of June 23, 1946, and the birth of the Republic. The Salerno turning point represents one of the most delicate moments in 20th century Italian political history. It takes place in the spring of 1944 in a wartime context where the German occupation of much of the national territory and the increasingly evident crisis of the monarchical model formed the basis for a movement of strategic redefinition. For all the anti-fascist forces, especially for the Italian Communist Party, which until then had played almost alone on the sidelines, reluctant to trust the other groups that had partly marginalized it. And in some ways, it was also seen as a sort of long arm of Moscow in Italian affairs. More than a single event, the Salerno turning point was a complex political process that involved a deep revision of the priorities of the anti-fascist struggle and a compromise decision destined to influence the birth of Republican democracy, or if you will, the very rebirth of Italian democracy after the dark period of the 20-year fascist era and the war. To understand the Salerno turning point, its real impact on the country's political life, it's necessary to start with the dramatic context. Let's start in the 1920s when fascism, asserting itself through violence and then through the fraudulent law, the Acerbo law, managed to take control of the state essentially with the acquiescence of the sovereign. The Aventine secession, the attempt to shake the conscience of Italy, had not worked, and it had gradually marginalized the political parties, which had been banned, forced into hiding, into exile, just like Italy itself. Exile that had also been marked by murders abroad. Think of Turati and the Rosselli brothers, or by militant commitment and even military involvement during the Spanish Civil War with the international brigades. The Garibaldi Battalion, which fought at Guadalajara, where it even defeated the fascist formation sent by Mussolini himself. But after July 25, 1943, with the fall of Mussolini, with the end of the fascist period, at least within the Kingdom of Italy, the political parties opposed to fascism had timidly returned, reappearing in the public and social life of Italians. Little by little, the old leaders had returned to public life or from exile, asserting the need for a new phase. However, this phase was interrupted by the armistice of September 8th. Dennis Mack Smith talks about it openly, but he's not the only one. From that date on, Italy found itself divided in two. We know this. In the south, the Kingdom of Italy with the Allies. In the north, the RSI supported by the Nazis. The collapse of state institutions was practically total. The army had disbanded. The Royal Navy had surrendered in Malta. King Vittorio Emanuele III and the Badoglio government had abandoned Rome. In this scenario, the anti-fascist forces, the communists, but not only them, think of the socialists, the Popular Party members, those who would later be called Christian Democrats, the liberals, the Action Party members. The Republicans had organized themselves into a force called the National Liberation Committee, the CLN, taking on the task of leading the resistance. As Ginsburg rightly wrote, However, the anti-fascist front was anything but homogeneous. The ideological differences were deep, as were the disagreements on the institutional question. Should they continue to trust a monarch who had bowed to Mussolini and given him free rein for 20 years? Or try to change, to turn the page, to follow the old projects of some elderly men, survivors from the last Risorgimento era, who dreamed of a republic? Should they continue to cooperate with the government? Badoglio, who, yes, had closed the fascist chapter, but had been unable to handle the post-armistice phase, causing the geographical and geopolitical split of Italy, or should they make a radical break? Should they immediately continue with a national uprising to send a signal both to Italian politics and especially to the whole world, or proceed gradually in building a new state? These are all questions that political parties within the Kingdom of the South are asking themselves at the end of 1943. The turning point, however, is marked by the return to Italy in March 1944 of Palmiro Togliatti, the secretary of the Italian Communist Party. He returns to Italy after a long exile in the Soviet Union, where he was trained to create a militant force capable of becoming, in the following years, together with its French counterpart, the leading communist party in Europe, in terms of numbers and power. The arrival of Togliatti marks a decisive turning point in the political line of the PCI, which from that moment regains clear leadership. And it must submit to the ideas and programs brought by Togliatti, even at the cost of renouncing some choices made up to that point. In fact, until then, the party had maintained a strictly anti-fascist but also anti-monarchist position, refusing any collaboration with institutions that had previously been tainted by the regime. This meant rejecting the authority of Badoglio, his cabinet, even the king himself, who in the eyes of the communists were guilty of a very serious offense, collusion with the fascists. However, Togliatti brings with him a different vision, shaped both by the context of international politics and by Soviet directives. Togliatti understands something that the leaders of his party, up to that point, had refused to see. That is, the absolute priority cannot be the revolutionary transformation of the state. Among other things, this meant following a doctrine that had already been abandoned by the Soviet Union. The urgent issue of defeating Nazi fascism was put first. The defeat of Nazi fascism and, as a secondary directive, the reconstruction of a stable political order. In this sense, Togliatti proposes a line that will become known as the line of national unity, a doctrine that calls for collaboration with all anti-fascist forces, including the monarchists, and the temporary shelving of the institutional question. Togliatti basically says, let's all work together. Let's set aside our differences for the moment. The top priority must be the liberation of the country and its reconstruction. Then, once these phases are completed, we will discuss what the new institutional structure of Italy will be. The so-called Salerno turn takes shape through a series of talks and political decisions that radically change the attitude of the PCI. First of all, the acceptance of the monarchy, not in an absolute sense, but as a temporary stopgap solution. The PCI temporarily gives up its demand for the king's abdication, recognizing the need to maintain institutional continuity, a stabilizing support for the Italian state. Then comes the entry into the Badoglio government. The communists decide to join the government together with all the other anti-fascist forces. A true government of national unity is formed, recognizing the necessity and urgency of participating.
In maniera collettiva alla lotta.
Then priority is given to the war of liberation. The fight against the Germans and their fascist supporters is placed at the center of political action and government policy, subordinating every other issue to it. Finally, the postponement of the institutional decision. It is established within this complex agreement that the form of the state will be decided by the Italian people at the end of the war through a referendum. De Felice himself writes it. It's a key passage. This line marks an abandonment, at least temporarily, of the prospect of change in favor of a strategy that is defined as gradualist and inclusive. Gradualist because it proceeds step by step, avoiding leaps in the dark. Inclusive because it includes everyone, without distinctions and without quarrels. The Salerno turn. It is a pragmatic choice, dictated by the awareness of internal and international power relations. It must be said, however, that the Salerno turn is not unanimously accepted. Within the same Communist Party, there is some resistance, especially among the more radical cadres, those who are pushing for immediate revolution, and who see, in the party's collaboration with the monarchy, a sort of betrayal of the original ideals, the anti-fascist ones. Other political forces also react with a certain ambivalence. The socialists, who had split from the communists in a major split at the Livorno Congress, while partly sharing the line of national unity, fear an excessive moderation. The Action Party, which proves to be the most uncompromising, criticizes the compromise with the king, considering it incompatible with a true break from the past. On the other hand, Togliatti's decision helps to calm tempers with regard to the Western allies, especially the British and Americans, who looked with extreme suspicion at a possible revolutionary development in Italy, did not trust Togliatti and his leadership group that had come from Moscow. But the turning point favors international recognition of the PCI as a responsible and reliable political force, and reassures the British and Americans who from that moment on are convinced that Italy will be on their side until the end without any reckless moves. The Salerno turning point must, however, also be understood in light of an extremely complex international context. In 1944, the Soviet Union was still engaged in the war effort against Nazi Germany, and it had every interest in maintaining good relations with those allies who financed it, who provided it with valuable materials, and who protected the convoys passing through the dangerous Arctic route. In this context, Palmiro Togliatti's line fits into the broader strategy of the international communist movement, which at the time favored collaboration over immediate revolution. The policy of popular fronts, which had already been tried in France and especially in Spain in the 1930s, finds a new application. A different application, an application centered on complete unity rather than polarization. The Italian choice proves to be consistent with the geopolitical vision that sees stability and cooperation among the great powers as a top priority. The Salerno turning point sets a precedent, and its effects are profound and long-lasting. First of all, the turning point helps to strengthen the National Liberation Committee and consolidate the anti-fascist front, making the fight against the occupation more effective. Secondly, it facilitates the institutional transition towards the Republic. Postponing the monarchy issue helps avoid a split at the most critical moment of the war. Referring to the Salerno decision, the referendum of June 23, 1946 will mark the end of the monarchy and the birth of the Italian Republic. But even before that, the Salerno turning point will prove effective. When the monarch himself, Vittorio Emanuele III, in a desperate attempt to save the monarchy, will break what was an unwritten pact with the political parties, abdicating and appointing his son Umberto as king in his place. Umberto, who until then had been the lieutenant of the realm, exercising a role that was much more than symbolic, became monarch for about a month, demonstrating the validity of the Salerno turning point and the hostility of the monarchy, which from that moment on becomes an enemy. But we will already be in a different post-war phase. The participation of political parties, and specifically of the PCI in the government and in legal political life, helps to legitimize that party as a central player. It also favors, from a post-war perspective, when the PCI will become the first and largest opposition party in a close contest at the polls with the DC, to become the party with the relative majority. The Salerno turning point has been the subject of numerous historiographical interpretations, sometimes divergent, it must be said. A first interpretation considers it a choice of political realism necessary to face an exceptional situation. From this perspective, Togliatti would have shown a remarkable ability to adapt to the situation, avoiding adventures that could have ended in complete failure. Other historians instead have emphasized the imposed nature of the shift, highlighting the role of the Soviet Union, which acted behind the scenes. From this point of view, by accepting a pact that was theoretically against its own nature and international pressures, according to this interpretation, the PCI would have given up an independent line, subordinating itself to foreign geopolitical logics. It would have resumed this independent line only later. The events of Prague in 1968, which we have already discussed in another video that you can find on the channel. A third interpretative line highlights the long-term strategic dimension. The Salerno turning point would have allowed the PCI to establish itself in Italian society and become a mass political force. Here are the foundations of popular support: the outright renunciation of revolution in order to become a party increasingly present on the social scene of our country. Regardless of the various interpretations, the Salerno turning point remains a crucial moment in our history, a moment in which contingent needs and strategic choices intertwine. The turn represents an emblematic example of how, in times of crisis, politics must confront significant limitations, set by a reality that goes beyond utopias. It was not a simple compromise, it was not simply a pact. The Salerno turning point was an act of refounding Italian political culture. When judging this event, it is necessary to avoid both apologetic interpretations and purely critical and defeatist ones. The turn was at the same time a renunciation and a conquest, an immediate and radical transformation. It could have done a lot of harm to the liberation struggle simply by advancing and favoring a vision that was not comprehensive, but only from a single position. The achievement was the creation of a lasting political space with defined identities, but still demonstrating the ability to engage in dialogue. Ultimately, the turning point contributed decisively to the construction of that democratic Italy in which we still live today. It showed that even in the most dramatic moments, solutions, though imperfect, there is absolutely nothing in this world. The road to the future, the foundations of the referendum of June 23, 1946, but above all the foundations of the Constituent Assembly, which was elected on the same dates and would work for 18 months on the drafting the Constitution. They were laid there in Salerno in the spring of 1944, where all the political parties set aside. For once, the differences, the quarrels, the suspicions, and of course, narrow vested interests. To work all together in a united way, they created a small utopia. Unfortunately, it didn't last. It wasn't meant to last forever, but it proved one thing, that when faced with risk, with circumstances, with the need to fight a common enemy, you can form a united front, you can work together, you can achieve a great result. And that's what happened. Our republic was born there. It was born in Salerno more than a year before the referendum, well before the approval and promulgation of the Constitution. If today we live in a democratic Italy, we also owe it to those gentlemen who, in that spring of 1944, while the fighting was still going on, decided to shake hands, to no longer be distrustful, and to cooperate together. That lesson should still be applied today, not only in Italy, but throughout the world. In the face of certain crises, the only solution is to work together, without reservations, without the desire to dominate, and without claiming to be right or to possess more truth than others.